All right. I know we still have some folks trickling in, but we're going to start right on the hour here. I hope everyone enjoyed lunch. I hope everyone's not too lethargic after the lunch and feeling good, because we have a really great session. This is the Scaling Atlassian track, and this session is going to feature Mark Gidwani from Johnson & Johnson talking about their journey to enterprise agility and how they migrated 15 instances to data center. I'm going to give a quick fun fact about Mark that he actually just told me a few minutes ago. But back in the day, he used to work with Batman's brother. And by Batman's brother, I mean Michael Keaton's brother. So there's the fun fact. All right, y'all. Welcome Mark Gidwani from Johnson & Johnson. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? All right. It's hard to come up with a fun fact about yourself, and that's not so fun, but it's true. So again, my name is Mark Gidwani. At Johnson & Johnson, my role is really around all the application development tools, from all the way from requirements management, going all the way through testing and continuous integration, and hopefully someday continuous deployment. So we're going to talk about how we accomplished migrating many different instances that we had into one big data center instance. So, as a lot of you, I'm sure, are working in companies that are pretty diverse. And J&J, we're diverse in healthcare, right? So we have pharmaceuticals, we have medical devices, and we have consumer products. And the needs of those different sectors vary. And the applications that they need to deploy, both internally and customer-facing, are different as well. So J&J is about 150,000 employees, and we probably have twice that in partners and vendors working there as well. And with all that diversity, we have a lot of different ways that people want to work. So dealing with that is a challenge. So as we started back in about 2014, 2015, we had a company-wide initiative to go more agile. There were teams already doing agile for many, many years, but from a broad-based vision, we said, let's go to enterprise agility. But we didn't really have any capabilities to do that. We had a lot of small instances out there, but we didn't have something that could support us at scale. And then we also had, for us, we have regulatory compliance needs. So we have to make sure that, as we're deploying something, it meets our QCSV validation. So we're going to discuss a little bit around how we handled the consolidation, getting into the details of what we did with add-ons, what we did with workflows, how we dealt with custom fields, and then user permissioning as well. And then we're going to get in the meat of the discussion, which is how did we actually go about doing the consolidation and handling the migration. And then we're going to wrap it up with, we're going to talk about benefits, and then we'll wrap it up with governance and maintenance. And so how do we continuously evolve, and then what processes are in place to ensure that we continue the success that we have. So balancing, if we talk about agile, right, it's about self-forming teams, it's about teams figuring out the best way they need to work. But when you're doing it at an enterprise scale, we have things that we have to worry about for metrics and reporting and things like that. So how do you balance those needs, right, becomes the challenge, right, to figure out what are the things you need to be standard on, and what are the things that can you allow the teams to have the more flexibility to do that, while still making sure that you're dealing with things like performance and cost and all these other things. So most of the teams that we had, right, had these small instances. They usually started with a team. It was usually in our commercial and website areas that we started out with. But it's usually somebody's side job, right? Somebody becomes, they start this Jira implementation. Bob, it's your job to go and manage this thing. There's only about 20 users, so it's not a big deal. And then more people kind of come in and say, well, we want to do that as well. Can we come on your instance? And then that grows, and the number of admins grows. And so it becomes something that's a lot more bigger than they thought when they started. And it becomes an issue to manage that, right? How do we get them to switch over to this enterprise instance, right? That's not something they generally want to do. They think, oh, I'm happy managing it myself, right? So how do you convert them and get them to do that? So with all those small instances, we had issues around trying to understand how much we were spending in the space, right? So we had replication of support, which was very inefficient. The TCO, or the total cost of ownership, wasn't understood across the tool sets that we had. And we didn't know who was managing these costs, right? So where are the costs actually, coming up through the organization? We also had consistency issues around integrations and reporting and those metrics. And then for us, since it started in our commercial space, we didn't have such a compliance need. But as we broadened that, as we started getting into other systems that required us to have computer system validation, we had the need for electronic signatures and managing electronic records, because Jira for us is a system of record for our SDLC documentation, right? And so doing that repetitively across many different instances becomes very cost prohibitive. So we knew when we were looking at trying to get to this large enterprise instance, we kind of had to frame out what were we going to be at the kind of the end of the road. So we knew we wanted to support about a peak user set of about 20,000 users. We wanted to make sure that we had redundancy, not only for the capability of having the systems up, but also for meeting our compliance needs. We actually ended up starting out on our on-premise data centers, but we quickly decided that it was better for us and more cost-effective for us to move to AWS. And so we were one of the first, I believe we were one of the first ones to move to AWS as we worked with Atlassian through that process. And then we needed a process in place to ensure that we had a solid DR strategy. Okay. So we started, like I said, we knew about 5 instances were out there. They varied in size. There were some instances that were 500 users. We had some instances that were 3,000 users. So, we also actually, through the process, probably did about, I think, 3 different acquisitions and 1 divestiture as well. So data that had to come into our system from companies that we had acquired, and also moving data out to other systems where the companies were divested. So through many different experiments, right, and we found a process I believe that worked for us, and that's what I'm going to share with you today. Okay. So our approach is broken down into 5 phases, right? We wanted to ensure consistency in the process, and we wanted to make sure that there was enough rigor involved so we could minimize any of the issues that we were dealing with through the migrations and consolidation, right? So we're going to go through all these different phases in a lot more detail. Excuse me. So the team that we put together, which was primarily our enterprise IT team, which was my team, that was supporting what we called the target instance, the enterprise instance. And we quickly realized that we didn't have the capabilities, both the knowledge or necessarily some of the utilities to help us do that. So we partnered with Botron software through Configuration Manager, but we also needed help with a lot of the complexities that we had to deal with, right? So as we were migrating data from one system to another, we also had to document migration protocols as part of our compliance requirements. So Botron really helped us with that process and driving a consistency with our QCSV team. We have the source system owners, right? The people that were going to be moving their data over from their systems over to ours. We had our compliance, quality and compliance groups that were sitting there monitoring the process. And then we had our Atlassian TAM Brad. I don't know if he's still here. Right, Brad. And then we had Atlassian Premier Support. So one of the key areas that we found was we needed to spend time to understand the detailed differences between the systems, right? So we had the source system, which was configured one way. We had our enterprise instance that was configured another way, right? But we also had to be very clear on certain things that we wanted to accomplish in the enterprise instance. And we just didn't want to take whatever information they had and just move it over as is, right? We wanted to look at things like how we were going to handle the add-ons, right? Was there things that were basically, capabilities that were in the source system, but we had a different way of handling that in the target system, right? The workflows, all the custom fields. So we also wanted to challenge the teams on why they needed to be unique and different, right? We do have some needs for that. So, as we're rolling out teams that are rolling out SAP, people that are rolling out Salesforce.com, people that are doing coding for websites, or coding for software as a medical device. So there are different needs that they have, but generally we're all developing and deploying applications and software. So how much different do we need to be from team to team? So, all those teams generally follow the same processes to get their software out the door, which follows our SDLC. Okay. So we didn't have that process defined during our first consolidation, right? We kind of had some learnings, figured out what worked for us, what didn't work for us, what things that we had to deal with as far as satisfying our quality and compliance group, and we had to develop and refine that process as we went along. Right? So I think it is very clear as you're getting into these discussions with the other system owners, be clear on what you're trying to accomplish with the enterprise instance, right? Because you're going to have issues with discussions around why is the system configured that way? They don't believe it should be configured that way. So being very clear around what the tenets are for that system is very important. And understanding what the impact of the decisions that you're going to make through the migration, and how that's going to affect cost, how that's going to affect performance, and how that's going to affect the supportability of the system. Right? So as we document the details of these migration decisions, we have what we called an application migration specification. And this was something that we came up with that really helped detail out all the decisions that we were going to make with the system owners, with the source system owners. Right? It helped us make sure that we get those decisions documented so we can go back and discuss that as we're going through the process. And it became critical for our partner to design how they were going to do the migration, how they were going to do the transformations of the data. So it was really critical for us to get to that point. Okay? And that's kind of where this heavy lifting is, I think, done for what we tried to accomplish, right? So what we set up was daily stand-up meetings to ensure that we had regular progress around trying to meet the goals, right? We had to document how we were going to address the decision-making of what we were trying to do, and then we're trying to stay true to the principles of our enterprise instance, right? Balancing the team's needs that were coming over was still trying to figure out this. I would love to say that, hey, we had everything right in the enterprise instance, we took nothing from the source systems, but in reality, we had that negotiation, trying to figure out what the best fit was, while still challenging figuring out what these teams really, their core needs were, with trying to still minimize some of the things for supportability. So, one of the key areas also we looked at is we wanted to get admin access to the source systems, right? The source system owners would tell us, here's how the system's configured, here are the things that we built in there, here are the workflows, all those different things. But we needed to find out and go and find out all the stuff they didn't tell us about, right? So there's a lot of things around, all these different setups that they had, add-ons that they were using, because a lot of different systems, like I said, they had a lot of different admins in these source systems. So it was critical for us to figure out what they were so we could understand and document those within the application migration specification. All right. So we had many fields that, custom fields that weren't relevant anymore, right, in these old systems, right? So a lot of them were created as one-off solutions for projects because that project team wanted to work in a certain way and they wanted to capture this data. We needed to look at the value of what was coming over, right? Because all that comes at a cost, right? We talked about the Lucene index, right, where you heard some good stories around they're redoing that, but that was causing us a lot of issues around figuring out how to minimize our indexing time. So keeping the amount of custom fields for us was critical. So our focus was to keep that as low as possible, right? The number of custom fields did impact our performance, but we wanted to understand and challenge the value of those things, right? So if they needed to capture information that was, for any particular purpose, we wanted to understand is there some way we can kind of come up with some consistency on how we are going to do that, right? So we wanted to balance the needs of the system to what the team's needs were, but still getting them to have some alignment. And so all this negotiation and these stand-up meetings and documenting these decisions in the application migration specification really was the heavy lifting of what we were trying to get accomplished so that we could get alignment around what we were trying to do, right? And it also helped us with our user communications because we wanted to tell the users that were coming from these source systems what their system would look like when they came over to the target system or the enterprise instance. Now, we're not going to be able to bring everything over, right? So there's not a home for every custom field that was in the source systems. So we came up with a way, really, to help those teams. And what we did was we said, okay, listen, all the data that you currently have in your system, we're going to move it over into 1 or 2 custom fields, I believe. We were going to come up with one custom field that was a readable blob field that had basically the label of the custom field and the value that it had. And we also created a JSON version of that as well. So we had a key value pair of here's the old field that we didn't bring over, and here's the value of that field. So why that was critical was a lot of the boards that they had were kind of tied to some of these fields that we weren't bringing over. So we needed a way that the boards themselves could be configured utilizing these legacy fields that we didn't bring over, and we could do that through the JSON and those key value pairs and that text readable field, right? It provided that history for them so they can still have access to the information that they had before the migration, right? It really helped with getting people aligned with they would still have access to the data that they were losing potentially as coming over to a standard set of custom fields. A lot of the permission models were different as well. So they would have role-based access on some of these systems, but they would generally decide what that was going to be project to project. For us, we decided we were going to implement a key model structure that allowed us to create some standard roles across every project that has a standard set of permissions. Okay? Because a lot of these source systems didn't have their stuff managed in AD either, so their username and password for them was going to be different, and we wanted to make sure it was all consistent with the enterprise. Okay, so we use Crowd for managing our connection between all our Atlassian tools and our interaction with Active Directory. So we use Active Directory groups that users can then go and request access to those groups. Those groups are brought into Jira and Confluence and Bitbucket with that permission set already defined, right? So it allows us to use our enterprise access management capabilities through Active Directory groups to do that. It allows us to manage that at scale. Okay. So most of the stuff, the projects we figured out that we really only needed 4 key project roles. We had a project admin, we had a Scrum master, we had a Scrum team, and then we had a viewer. And then through part of one of the migrations, actually, we decided they needed a business client because they wanted to be able to have the business client be able to create stories, but they couldn't do anything to move it through the workflow, right? So also when you're going through the process, right, so users have access to stuff, they're very concerned that their new project that they're going to come into in the enterprise instance you're not going to have all the permissions that they needed. So we really mapped out to make sure that the users were fitting in these roles, had the permissions they had from the systems that they were leaving. Okay. So third-party add-ons was a big one for us because they had a lot of add-ons that were added to these systems, and a lot of them were no longer in use, or somebody put them on there, so we had to go through a lot of evaluation through those third-party add-ons, right? We also were checking for the redundancy and the capabilities of some of the things. So, we have a drawing package in Confluence. We have, things for managing testing in our Jira instance. And so if they were bringing stuff over, we wanted to make sure that they were going to match up to the stuff that we already had as an offering in there, right? Those third-party add-ons also, a lot of them were, they weren't built for scale, right? So they weren't things that were data center compatible. Back when we started this, there wasn't the data center add-ons necessarily, but things were marked data center compatible or not, right? And we wanted to make sure that as we were bringing things over, that these add-ons could be supported. We had a few instances of add-ons that we did start with that when we had issues with, there was really nobody to turn to, right? So we wanted to make sure as we were going through the process, we weren't going to add any more of those types of add-ons on, and that these add-ons were actually supported very well. So we wanted to also make sure that they got tested effectively. So, even the add-ons that are data center compatible don't necessarily always have things that they think through at scale. So, when we connect to our Active Directory, our Active Directory has, I believe, 700,000 users in it. We don't bring all those over into to Jira or to Bitbucket or Confluence, but some things that, we have to make sure that it can handle that kind of scale. We have 3,200 projects. We have 15,000 users in Jira right now. We have 5,000 users in Bitbucket. And then we just went to unlimited for Confluence. So if they're doing a drop-down list for users, you want to make sure that how they're populating that list, because a lot of times, we go and try to do a search for a user in the add-on that we did, and it's taking a half hour, 40 minutes for them to populate the drop-down. So make sure you test those things as you're going and making sure that they can work at scale. Okay. So having that clear understanding of what the differences are and the complexities are between the environments, right? So there's technical things you have to potentially worry about. Where it's hosted, you have to worry about potentially the database that the system's running on, because as you're doing the migration, you're gonna have to deal with potentially going from an Oracle database and going to Postgres. And there's some technical things that you have to think about when you're doing that. And then you have to really take a look at automating everything that you can, both from a transformation perspective, but also from a verification perspective. For us, it was one of those things we had to do. We did 100% data verification of data that moved from the source system to the target system. We did that because we had to, and it was also the right thing to do, right? So ensured making sure when we were having conversations with the users that we could look them in the eye and say, we moved 100% of the data and we did 100% data verification.
How did you verify?
We did that all through automation. So we automated the testing that we looked at for all the different pieces of the data that moved to the data that came over. I'm sorry?
Was it a database-oriented check or API? Both.
Yeah. So, but we had to ensure that we did that, right? Again, it's the right thing to do, but we also had a compliance reason that we had to go do that. Okay? And that's why you bring the right expertise when you're doing that stuff. So that's why our partners at Botron really helped us make sure that we could accomplish doing all those things from their tool sets, but also from custom things that they also built and utilities that they did to help us through that migration and that testing. Okay? And we did that migration probably 10, 20 times. We built sandboxes, and that was a nice thing about AWS. We could spin up sandboxes in AWS, install the source system in there, install a copy of our target system, and run through the migrations and making sure that we accomplished everything we were trying to accomplish in that process. Okay. So after you've gone through all these 20 iterations or 10 to 20 iterations of verification, right, you want to make sure you're doing one last thing, one last migration. And it's really you're trying to do a like for like. You're trying to get the size of the source system you're trying to get the size of your target system, at least temporarily, to make sure that when you're going through the migration that everything's going to work correctly, right? For us, again, because of our compliance, we had to execute a formal migration in a quality assurance environment that we could sign off on and saying, yes, this process works. We're ensured when we go into production that this process will work. But it also helped us make sure that we communicated the downtime, right? So we wanted to make sure, how long did it take us from taking that source system down, doing the backups that we needed to do, moving the data and transforming the data, and then making that available in the target instance. In the very beginning, we actually took both the source system down and the target, our enterprise instance down, to ensure that we knew that it was going to work correctly. In the later migrations, we actually kept our enterprise instance up. We only took the source system down, migrated all the data, transformed all the data, put it into the target system. I think you're going to have to gauge on, how big is the data transformation happening that you're doing, right? So some of the later ones weren't as large, right? We had some very large ones where we took both systems down because we wanted to ensure that nobody was having basically issues because they were trying to use the system and it was being performance impact because of all the migrations and transformations that were happening. And then you want to make sure that the users at the end of the day get access to this staging environment. So they give them an opportunity to come in, poke around, play around, make sure that they're giving us feedback. They're saying, hey, you know what? This board isn't really showing up the right way. I was expecting to see this data and I don't see it anymore, right? So it gives us feedback so that we can go ahead and make any of those final changes that we need to do before we go into the production migration. So finally, you come to the actual day that you're going to do it, right? But in preparation of that, you also want to make sure you communicate. And this was probably one of the hardest things because we had so many users and so many systems, and you can't send an email out to 10,000 people through Outlook, right? There's limitations, so you have to figure out different ways to do that. So we had banners and the JIRAs that we were moving in the target system as well. But we also had broad communication meetings. We basically had an open mic session where people could call in, ask questions, get feedback, give us feedback on what was happening in the staging system that they were looking at. And then picking the right time to do the migrations. We always pick the weekends because of our minimal utilization during that time. And we also made sure that we lined up Premier support. So we would call Brad, our TAM, and say, listen, we're going to be doing the migration over these 4 hours. Can you make sure that we have a Premier support person lined up so that we call in, we get priority support during that time. And go through all that, we actually did really well. We didn't run into any migration issues, right? So when we did our first initial migrations, we held office hours. And so we would say, call in with any questions that you have. And it was surprising, there weren't that many people that would call in. I mean, we would get occasionally board configurations. They were expecting to see something that maybe looked a little different. And then we could adjust and help them readjust their board so that they could go and look at the stuff. But all the data came over correctly, and everything really went up flawlessly through all the different migrations. So, why did we go through this whole thing, right? So we wanted to make sure that these teams, as they were working, right? So we had a lot of teams that would be supporting. One would be supporting a consumer application project. Another one would be coming in and they'd do being a pharmaceutical, SAP implementation, and so but they had to shift JIRA systems all the time because different JIRA systems were being supported in different ways, right? So they had some consistency on how they were doing that because now they were in an enterprise instance that allowed them to access the same things. They could see how the workflows were configured, and they were kind of consistent with how they were doing their work, right? It also allows us to create that standard reporting, right? So we create a lot of Tableau reports on data so that we can see how teams are progressing across, how are the teams basically meeting on their commitments of what they believe that they're going to do in the sprint to what they deliver. So if you look at that now all on one system, it makes life a lot easier, right? It also simplified our SDLC deliverables. I talked about our system being the system of record for a lot of our SDLC, our product backlog and our sprint backlog. So those are key SDLC deliverables we had. We use it as a system of record. There's no need for us to print it out, put it in a document management system, which was key for us. We also had simpler configuration and kind of support costs, all right? Because we now didn't have that replication of support. We also had, the teams, really had one place to go to when they were going for support, right? So we could standardize the way we were doing the support. It wasn't you needed to talk to Mary when you're going to this system, right? We bring it through our normal ITSM process. We have a full support team behind it. We meet SLAs. We do the formal process that we always do in IT. Okay. So the team is managed like a Scrum team. So we have daily stand-ups that we talk through enhancements, but we also are talking through our support tickets, right? So, we have a team. We do it through, say, traditional product ownership. We figure out which things we're going to work on that are support issues, what issues we're going to work on for enhancements. And that team has a deep knowledge on all the tool sets, right? They have a deep knowledge not only from the infrastructure that it's sitting on, but also how the applications are working on it. And so having that dedicated team has really provided us some good wins. Okay. And then moving to AWS, it was a lot easier for us to spin up additional capacity. I talked through the migration process. It was critical for us to be able to spin up these sandboxes very quickly, tear them down. We didn't have to go through an internal approval process to go and get a requisition of a server or a database. And that redundancy that AWS provides us for multi-zones, not only from an application node perspective, but also from a database perspective, was also very cost effective and more so than it was for us internally. All right. So the critical thing for trying to make sure that these teams feel that they're being heard, we implemented implemented one thing first. One thing we called it was the customer advisory group. And so that was anybody that wanted to come in, talk about their needs. We talked about it as a group, and it's an open session that we hold monthly. As the system grew and grew and grew, we realized we really couldn't make decisions necessarily that were impacting the entire system based on a lot of people that were providing input, right? So we still provide that input, and it's a key funnel for what things and enhancements we're going to go look at, but we also implemented a governance team. And we built the governance team with really the thought leaders of the agile experts that we had in each one of the sectors and each one of the development centers, so that those were the people that most of the other people were looking to on how to do the best practices. So getting their input, having them sit on the governance team really provides that capability for us to formalize and make our decisions on our backlog, enhancements, our standards that we were going to follow. So I mentioned this several times. It's one of my things. Keeping the amount of custom fields that you have to a minimum really will help impact your performance, right? It's also much simpler to manage for us not to have all these different global custom fields out there. So it's probably one of my pet peeves and the thing that we argue about the most internally. So we also attempted at the very beginning to say, let's come up with one workflow that works for everybody, right? I'd say is you want to make sure that you don't have one workflow per project, but you're going to have different teams have different needs in the way they work, right? So again, we try to minimize the number of workflows, but trying to create that balance again between let's be standard, but let's also make sure that the teams are agile and they can kind of decide how they're going to do work, but try to keep that at more the department or the group level so that you have maybe one workflow that's supporting all supply chain, or one workflow that's supporting digital website development. Okay. We talked about add-ons a lot too. So determine ones that meet your needs. test to ensure that they can work at scale, and research the vendor's ability to actually do the support. So again, for us, we got burned a few times where we had issues with the vendors not being able to support at scale when we had issues, and they couldn't also get back to us in a timely manner. So we want to make sure always that we're looking at that as well. Okay. So we're looking at moving to archiving. I'd love to say that we're already at incremental archiving. We're getting to the point now. We have 2.5 million issues. We have 15,000 users. We have 3,200 projects. We need to get into archiving. So that is one thing we're going to be looking at, and we're really looking forward to hopefully doing filter-based archiving when that comes available, because we want to be able to take a project that's still going to be live but get rid of some of the older issues. So those are the key things that we're looking on right now. So thank you, and I think we have a few minutes for questions.